Hi there, and welcome to our lecture on ethnographic and observational research. Here's what we'll be learning in this video. We're going to look at the value of ethnographic and observational research in account planning. We're going to discuss how to design an ethnographic or netnographic study, and we're going to learn how to analyze ethnographic and netnographic data. Importantly, these are all skills that you'll be implementing for your group projects in this class. I want to start off by highlighting a woman named Margaret Mead, who was one of the founders of the field of anthropology. She was an incredibly influential researcher who really shaped how we structure and conduct ethnographic work. Her work, her ability to live within a culture and to develop this deep understanding of individuals and of human behavior, is what really shaped ethnography in the way that we practice it today. Now, even though we in this class may not consider ourselves anthropologists, it's important you understand and recognize that anthropology as a field really shaped social science and the qualitative research that we do as advertisers and market researchers. So what is ethnography? Ethnography is the study of people and the cultures they create. It's a way to describe human interactions and behaviors. It is taking a deep and careful look into people's lives and cultures. In the case of account planning and advertising research, the whole idea of ethnography is that with an ethnographic study, we're able to observe how particular brands are integrated into people's daily lives. To give you an example of great ethnographic work, I want to tell you about one of my favorite studies, a market research study that was published about the American Girl doll franchise and brand. Now, I suspect that many of you in this class had American Girl dolls as a kid, and believe it or not, I did as well. It's a brand that has really lasted and grown across many generations, so it was a particularly interesting one to study. So for this study, basically a researcher went to the American Girl doll store, I believe the one in Chicago, and sat there and observed people over and over and over again for days upon hours upon weeks, and subsidized those observations with in-depth interviews in people's homes. And through all of those observations and interviews, the author was really able to see how young children not only went into the store and bought the toys, but also how they bought all of the assets that were related to maintaining the toy, and how they completed all these activities that surrounded the identity of being an American Girl doll consumer. Understanding how brands evolve and develop meaning in people's lives within a social structure is critical to organizations and to advertising campaigns. So with ethnography, by being an observer of what people are doing, we're trying to build networks of patterns of what people's daily lives are like and how these patterns relate to the brand that you're trying to research. Here are the basic steps for conducting an ethnographic study. The first step is to gain access to your target population in a naturalistic setting. Sometimes it helps to find a specific person to be your cultural entree, someone who can help you gain access to the particular population that you're interested in studying. In your textbook, there's this great example of a local trusted pharmacist who helped researchers gain access to the HIV positive population in a small rural town. Without the help of that pharmacist, the researchers might never have gotten anyone in the target group to open up to them. The second step is to build trust with your participants. You can't necessarily just waltz in and start asking tough questions. It often takes time for your participants to get used to you being in their space before they're willing to open up and talk to you. The next step is to gather your data in an ethical way, making sure that people know that you are conducting the research and making sure that you're not interfering or influencing their daily lives, thereby not causing any harm and maximizing their benefit. The fourth step is to analyze your data using a process of coding and categorization that we'll talk more about in a few slides. And last but not least, the fifth step is to ensure the validity of your data by providing opportunities for culture member feedback. It's always a good idea to go back to the participants and have them verify whether your impressions and interpretations of what they did and said are correct. And you have to be open to revising your interpretation based on these conversations that you're continually having with participants. Now, there are different roles that a researcher observer can take. The first type is called complete observer. This is when the researcher is solely observing without participants knowing that they're there. This is the true fly on the wall sort of method. Observer as participant is where the participants are aware of the research and know the goals of the study, but often with limited interaction between the researcher and the participants. So they know that the research is happening and the researcher is in the environment, everyone knows that they're there, but they're still mostly a fly on the wall, very unobtrusive. Then there's participant as observer, where the researcher is fully engaged with the participants. They interact with the participants and everyone knows the goal of the research study. And finally, there's complete participant, where the researcher is fully embedded as a true participant of the target community. And in this case, the participants don't necessarily know about the identity of the researcher. The researcher is sort of acting like a spy or an undercover agent. Now, all of these methods have different pros and cons that you'd need to assess in order to decide which to adopt for your study, depending on the cost-benefit analysis of, for example, are people going to change the way they act or what they say if they know that you're researching? Or would it help if they know that you're conducting this research, right? Maybe it would cause them to elaborate more fully if they know that you're trying to understand what's going on. And of course, this will depend on your identity and whether or not you can blend in as a member of the target population. If you're researching how college students interact with brand X that they sell at the student union, then yeah, you can probably blend in and perhaps be a complete participant. But if you're researching how suburban moms interact with brand X, then you'd probably choose a method where you make your presence as the researcher known. So what should you actually observe when you're out in the field conducting an ethnography? It's important to observe what people do and not just what they say. You want to make note of the settings and the surroundings. You want to observe events that involve more than one person, have history and consequence, and are repeated over time. And finally, you might want to count to find patterns and consensus within a particular culture. So if you were conducting an ethnography at a Starbucks to learn about the culture of Starbucks consumers in a particular location, you might want to take note of how many people come into the store in a given period of time. What type of mood did they seem to be in? What are they wearing? What does their body language say? What do they actually say to the Starbucks employees? What do they order? How much is the total of their order? Are they buying food or just beverages? How long do they stay? Do they come in a group or just by themselves? And so on and so on and so on, right? Really capturing the ins and outs of what's going on in that particular store at that particular time. It should be easy for you to see how field notes could easily amount to many, many, many pages of notes. There are additional applications of observational research that you might consider using as an account planner. There are what we call shop-alongs, where the researcher goes and pretends to shop with the participant. They follow someone that's shopping and catalog how the respondent shops for certain items, and might ask them certain questions about the process, either during or right after. The goal here is to understand the consumer in the purchase environment. There's also mystery shopping, where the researcher pretends to be a participant. And this is an excellent way, for example, if you're trying to learn more about the brand, to see what it is that the brand is communicating to consumers at the point of purchase, or on the website, or even on social media. So pretending to be a consumer and be exposed to all of those different messages. Now, a lot of ethnographic work is traditionally done in person, where you go to a physical store or the physical space where your consumers live and shop and interact with the brand. But there is a new and emerging and increasingly important method that applies this methodology to the online world. And it's a method that's going to be particularly useful to us during this time of the COVID pandemic. It's what we call a netnography, or a digital ethnography. Let's watch this video from the creator of the term netnography to learn more about it.
My name is Robert Kozinets, and I've been at the Annenberg School since 2016. I founded a technique called netnography in 1995, which is an adaptation of the anthropological technique of ethnography, which is participant observation, but it's applied online to social media, to the communications and the connections that people form online with one another. Big data tends to look at conversations online in a statistical way and a decontextualized way so that you can be more precise. Ethnography tends to dive deeper into the context behind the individual conversations, postings, interactions, and experiences. It kind of is more focused on meaning than on precision. I don't necessarily just want to know what a tweet says or how many people tweeted with a particular hashtag. I want to know who tweeted with that hashtag and exactly how they tweeted. So I'm really much more interested in telling a whole story. And I developed this technique into a way to study consumers as a marketing research method initially, and it's become a wider method adopted across the social sciences for understanding the kinds of cultures and communities, the gatherings, the interactions and experiences that people have online. My research since about 2003 has been really focusing on how consumers play with the stories that they're told about products and services, then go online and create their own storytelling worlds. One of the early research sites that I studied was online coffee culture, a group called alt.coffee. One of the things that I was really interested in was how people were teaching each other about coffee and what they said about coffee. And there, hundreds of people got online and discussed their coffee tastes, their coffee equipment, coffee making. And what I quickly found out was there was this incredibly complex vocabulary that people had figured out of describing exactly what the perfect shot of espresso was like. They used words like astringent and a taste of bitterness. They were very attuned to aftertastes. Even the timing of tastes was described. From that, I really got a sense of just how much can be communicated and just how strongly taste can be challenged and created through these online conversations. Online was a place where people were going to learn and other people were clearly influencing their tastes. If you find the lead user and follow their tastes, it tells you about where the taste of the mainstream might be going. As I started to move beyond coffee culture, it was true in fashion, it was true in sports, it was true in entertainment. Now, if you're in marketing, if you're in PR, if you want to understand brands and branding, this kind of a holistic contextualized understanding is incredibly valuable.
So let's highlight the steps for conducting ethnographic research. Ethnography starts by recording data, either by copying and pasting or by using data mining software and tools. You can record observations by combing through an online community. Data collection here might include actual interactions or content, sources or people and their own connections, and the networks, looking at how people connect around a particular topic. For example, on Facebook groups for followers of a particular brand. Here's an exercise that I invite you to do if you have time and you're on Facebook. Check out the Facebook groups for Aldi or Costco shoppers. It is fascinating to see how the consumers form identities around a particular store brand. Now, how do you analyze ethnographic data? You build themes that evolve from both patterns and outliers. Often, we focus on building consensus on what is the most prevalent type of behavior, and that's definitely important. However, it's also important to note that sometimes looking at the outliers can give us really great ideas of insights that we can turn into strategy. After analyzing the data, you want to ensure that the interpretations are trustworthy and reflect the culture to enhance the validity of your interpretations. So whenever possible, you want to check with members of the community to make sure that they're treated ethically and represented accurately. And just like with traditional ethnography, you're going to have to decide whether or not you should disclose your positionality as the researcher. And that's going to be a different decision in every case based on how sensitive the topic is and how similar or dissimilar you are to the target group. You also have to be very careful about confidentiality and anonymity of the informants. The people you interact with online have a right to confidentiality, And since you're in an online environment, you also want to be mindful that you might have accessed information from people who are outside of your primary target group. And you need to make sure you protect their confidentiality as well. All right, so let's say you've done your ethnographic work. You went into the field or you went online and spent a whole lot of time observing and interacting and recording your impressions. And now it's time to make sense of all that information. There are different techniques for making sense of the data. First, I'll mention the deductive approach, which we tend not to use in qualitative research. So we'll come back to this in a few weeks. But basically, this is where you have some theory or prediction, and then you take your observations and you try to see how they fit into that theory. But again, that's really more appropriate for quantitative work. For qualitative research, we generally use an inductive approach to data analysis. This is where you start with the observations, you look for patterns across many observations, and then based on those patterns, you can draw conclusions that can later inform theory. You also might use what's called a recursive approach, which is kind of a hybrid of these two approaches. This is where you might start with a theory, but you don't limit your observations to what the theory predicts. Instead, you're open to revising the theory and going through this circular, iterative process from theory to observation and back around again. How do you code your data? You have all these observations, all these data points, and now it's time to make sense of them. There are two main strategies that you should utilize here. First, coding is the process of giving meaning to a unit of data. Codes are shorthand devices and labels that separate, compile, and organize data. So these are the interpretations, the themes that you've identified that you're going to use in drawing conclusions from your data. Then, categorization is where you identify a chunk of data as belonging to or being an example of some more general phenomena. And you go through all of your codes to see which categories they belong to, right? You'd go through, you'd start categorizing and say, this particular quote belongs to this theme, and I'm seeing this theme and it's repeated over here, so I'm going to categorize it in this way. Categories are not necessarily predefined. You might have a few to start out with, but then they most definitely will evolve over the process of coding and categorization. Now, this whole process of coding and categorizing can be done with software, which hopefully you'll have access to once you're in your fancy future account planning jobs. But for now, we'll focus on manual data analysis. There are basically two primary ways to do this. First, there's the long table or pile method, where you start sorting themes and copying and pasting them into tables to organize examples of observable patterns. It's kind of like a big Excel sheet. You have all this transcript and you start copying and pasting and saying, okay, this quote belongs in this category and this observation or impression belongs in this category. Good old-fashioned sticky notes are a really great way to use this method. The other method, called the notebook method, is where you develop a codebook in advance and then you go through each transcript or each impression and you start giving each unit of analysis a code from the codebook. For this method, you really have to have a great exhaustive codebook that is as comprehensive as possible to be able to make this an efficient way of coding your data. To wrap up, here are some key tips for collecting ethnographic data. First, make sure you set the context. What is it exactly that you're trying to observe? This should relate back to your problem definition from last week. Make sure you build rapport with participants. Take field notes and gather information in different modalities, pictures, quotes, artifacts, etc. Review your field notes frequently and fill in any gaps that might be missing. Write summaries of your impressions right away after every data collection session. Ensure that you record your impressions in multiple formats, such as recordings of interviews, taking pictures, writing down field notes. Also, you have to balance out if having a recorder is going to interfere with your rapport with participants. If so, you might just want to take notes the old-fashioned way and record your impressions right after. If it's not going to interfere, then having those recorded interviews later can be really helpful. You also want to pay attention to data saturation. Once you've seen consistency in what you're observing, in other words, you've seen that multiple people are giving you repeated information and you feel like you've discovered everything there is to discover about the particular question, That's a good indication that you might be done with your data collection and ready to move on to analysis. And once you're in that analysis phase, you want to look for patterns, themes, ways to explain the phenomena at hand, and illustrate these things in a variety of ways by using quotes, pictures, recordings, and drawings. Even with an online ethnography, you'd want to have pictures, screenshots, quotes, anything that you can use to illustrate the patterns that you've observed and the points you're trying to make. To help you see the rich data that can come from ethnographic research, in this week's module, right under this video, I'm going to include a link to a video about research on IKEA, everyone's favorite household furniture shop. To recap, in this lesson, we understood the value of ethnographic and netnographic research. We learned how to design and analyze qualitative studies, both for ethnography and netnography. All right, so I hope you've enjoyed learning about the first type of data collection that you'll be doing for your group projects in this class. Next week, we'll move on to other types of qualitative research, namely in-depth interviews and focus groups. See you then.